Okay, this might sound a little weird, but talking about identification. And when it comes to identifying anything to species, be it birds or plants or mammals or what have you, one of the most important things, besides being able to identify species, is to recognize when you can't identify something to species, which sounds weird, right? But it's a big problem in a lot of the survey work that I've done. So you may know I used to run some marine bird and mammal surveys for the Fish and Wildlife Service up in Alaska, where we were trying to document whether or not species had been recovering from the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill. So pretty high stakes, and it was important to identify species correctly. And it was also important for us to recognize when there was something that was not a species that we were expecting. Um, so, what tends to happen, especially with less experienced observers, is that your head is so full of all these identification tips and tricks and, um, how to differentiate between closely related species and the minute little details you're looking for. Sometimes you can forget to step back and consider the whole picture. And one of the best examples of this was one day that we kind of all fell prey to it on our boat because there was this bird off in the distance and we were all squinting at it through our binoculars, and we were having a pretty lively debate over whether or not it was a black scoter or a white-winged scoter, which look fairly similar, but there's some ways you can tell it apart, and some of us swore we could see the little Nike marking on the face. um, However, as we got closer and closer to this bird floating on the water, just it something seemed off. There was something weird about this bird, and the debate kind of trailed off. And as we pulled even closer, we realized that that was not even a bird at all. It was actually a, a dead moose carcass that was for some reason floating 20 miles offshore, heading out to the Gulf of Alaska. And we had been so focused in on these minute details that we had missed the fact that this was not a bird. It wasn't even a live animal. It was a floating, bloated carcass. So that's just an example of how some fairly experienced observers could get caught up in this. The problem is even more exacerbated with newer observers. So one of the things I liked to do with my crews was get them together before the survey started and just flash a bunch of really blurry, awful pictures on a screen, and then I'll kind of call out IDs so that the newer people could see that there were times when the more experienced folks were willing to say, I have no idea what that is. That is an unidentified duck. That is an unidentified gull. That's an unidentified bird. That's an unidentified object. And I think being able to see that even people who are really good at this stuff will often have times that they just can't make a definitive ID. I think that helped the novice observers a lot. And it solved a lot of problems for us because there were some species that were pretty tricky to identify, and they were super high stakes because, they had been affected a lot by the oil spill, and, the evidence was mounting that something needed to be done. And the last thing we wanted is a bunch of people misidentifying other birds as this particular species. We wanted an actual accurate representation of what was out there. And it was much better to admit uncertainty and call it an unidentified seabird rather than try to take a really good guess. So keep that in mind, that it's important to recognize when you don't know for sure what the species is. And so in our quizzes, I'm going to try to program them so that there's always a uh, partial credit answer where you can just identify it to family. So you can just put in unidentified Inatidae if it's an unidentified duck, or it's a duck, you just can't tell the species. So definitely keep that in mind. It becomes really important when we have the opportunity to identify birds that aren't typically in our area. So if we are all just restricting our choices to the species we know, it's really easy to miss species that aren't usually present, but that have moved into the area for some reason. So definitely in our seabird work in Alaska, there was one winter when all of a sudden there were a lot of crested auklets around, which was not a species that had ever been recorded in the Sound. Um, but because we were able to recognize that, hey, this is a bird that's not on our list, and geez, what is that? Well, what are the characteristics? It looks a lot like this other species. I probably would have called it this if I hadn't been open to this idea that it might be something else. And we were able to figure this out, and it ended up being one of the early warning signs of a massive die-off that was happening among the seabird world. And birds were actually coming into the Sound because they were starving to death out where they normally are in the winter, and they were showing up in our area. And because we were able to recognize this unusual species in our survey area, that gave us, you know, some early information on this massive event that was going on. So that's another good reason not to just restrict yourself to the species that you know. So for that reason, you will find in our quizzes for this class, I will eventually nastily throw in something that's not on our list. And the idea is for you to be able to pick up on the fact that it's not one of the birds you know and recognize that and indicate, you know, unidentified whatever in as your answer, or if you can look it up, or if you happen to know what it is, you can identify the correct species as well. And there'll be more directions on that as we go. But, you know, brace yourselves for that to happen because, like I said, it's almost as important as being able to identify species themselves, as being able to recognize something that you're not expecting. All right, that's my little spiel. So it should add a little extra element of adventure to our quizzes. And I hope you enjoy the opportunity to stretch your identification and unidentification skills. All right, thanks, guys.